hate everything.
Always. Hey y'all, I was just pontificating
Not pontificating
about
life.
Y'all listen. It is very easy to tell people who are organized, like community grassroots organizers and academics who style themselves as activists and organizers. And generally speaking, the latter cannot tell the difference. I'm an academic, but I could tell the difference because motherfuckers just be saying shit. But hey, y'all, how you doing? How's it going?
Hello.
With Guan. Hey, Ricky.
Oh my goodness.
We got a good conversation today on this solar eclipse Monday.
Yep. I don't know why that made me want to go pew pew pew
Pew pew. Wait a minute. Okay, so is the eclipse over now?
Yeah, it's over. I told you it was gonna be quick.
So what was the ring? Did you see the ring? We missed it.
Yeah, it's like because you know as it moves, like it's you
once
see,
it's like perfectly lined up and makes the ring.
Yeah.
Motherfuckers was traveling for that little pinch or something.
Well, it is. It's over here. We back to regular sunlight for the most part. Yeah.
But wouldn't it be over everywhere?
It should be because we're at the tail end of it.
Yeah,
we're supposed to be the tail end of it.
I can't believe people were traveling across the country for that little thing.
I can see it for the kids. Like it's a exciting experience
in this economy. Traveling
not in the same
across
place.
State lines. Decolonize the eclipse, my nigga. It's still there out here if you look through the glasses. We looked through the glasses. I actually looked up without the glasses too, and I'm fine, you guys. I didn't stare up, but I just did a quick glance to see what the hype was about. Because I think it's the big glasses lobby that make us think we can't look up.
Big glasses lobby.
Don't look up. See, it's don't look up all over again.
Lord.
It's big glasses trying to make y'all think you can't look up. As my retinas scorch.
Well, it's back to regular light now because it had actually gotten dark.
Yeah.
Here.
Hey y'all, what's up, y'all? So okay, we got a lot to talk about today. Of course, we'll start with life. Other than the solar eclipse, it was cool though. The solar eclipse, yeah. Waning gibbous. I don't know why I know that one. Waxing and waning gibbous, but okay. So I did a talk at Vanderbilt on Friday. And I want to lift that up in particular because there's a lot of repression that's going on at Vanderbilt right now. But first, shout out to the BAP homies. I saw Wolfgang and Denzel, a couple other folks who pulled up to the talk. So shout out to BAP. But yeah, so there some students were doing a sit-in for Palestine and to get, I think, Vanderbilt to divest from any Israeli interests. And essentially, I guess what happened was the building was closed and there was a security officer who was pushing the door closed and the students kind of like bum rushed it and the officer fell to the ground. And so initially, I think it was almost 30 students were suspended pending a hearing. The hearing, by the time I got there Friday, the hearing had happened and 3 students were actually expelled. And I think the rest of the students by and large were reinstated. But basically, I guess the 3 students who were expelled were the ones who initially kind of shoved the door open. But so there was a big discussion about that, which had happened to them. There were some professors that were one in particular.
Expulsion.
Yeah, there was one in particular who was like, well, if you put your hands on me, that changes the game entirely. I was like, first of all, if they were pushing the door open, the dude, like, you know, like there's all sorts of assumptions. Number one, if they see that police as legitimate, right? When there's all of this, police off campus movement. And then they were like, well, these weren't police. These were security officers. And it's like, well, move, motherfucker. Like, this ain't your building. Like, get out the way. Like, why are you risking life and limb for this building that you don't own? Like, get out the way. Secondly, it's kind of like people talk about students as customers. Well, isn't the customer always right? These are the people who are paying to be there.
That's what they say.
It's a bunch of shit. But anyway, so
they're only right as long as they're Zionists.
They're only right as long as they're Zionists and if they're on financial aid, apparently. Because I think this was mostly like racialized student. Actually, no. What they also said was that Black students there didn't actually support this particular effort for whatever reason. And so that was a whole other thing. This professor was like, well, basically not on some kind of like nationalist shit, like not supporting these students because of their critique of the Black students. But come to find out, this particular professor, he was in the military. And then at one point he dropped this gem at dinner that he had helped to shoot down rockets coming into Israel at some point in his career. And so all of us were like, so anyway. But shout out to Vanderbilt. It was a good, I think it was a good talk. Michael Eric Dyson came, which anyway, I made it out, y'all. It was a good talk. I think it was a good engagement. But free to guys. Like, the repression of these student protesters has to stop. And like any professor, any person who claims that they're committed to Black studies and knows about the formation and the struggle for Black studies cannot purport to be for the discipline if you're against protesting and organizing, period. Like, that's goofy as fuck. Okay, I have a talk at Amherst College and UMass Amherst tomorrow. So I'm going to talk in a class at Amherst College. Shout out to Stephen Bradley. And then I have a talk at UMass. I'll be in conversation with Toussaint Lossier, also a member of BAP. And so that should be cool. So next week I'll report back on that. But basically, like, I'm rounding third base with these talks. I'm almost done. I think I have a bunch of like random like panels and things here and there. But in terms of book talks, I think I have one or two more. And then this month, and then one in May at UCLA. Then I'm done until the fall. So it's been a lot over the summer. I know. And then April 18th, I have my presentation at the Warren Center, as y'all know. Oh, what up, Wolfgang? Wolfgang was one of the BAP comrades who came to the talk. So April 18th, I have my presentation at the Warren Center. I'm on this fellowship at Harvard. And so I picked one of the latest dates because I knew I wasn't going to do shit. So I will have something to present. I swear I will. But I'd be lying if I said I have been working on it diligently this whole time. I had not. I mean, it's all up here. I've been working on it. But basically, I'm going to present something on the McCarthyist antecedents of Black power. So looking at parallels between discourses and practices that were happening between 1947 and 1957, and then basically like 1965 to 1975. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing. My mom was here this past week helping with the baby because I had the Vanderbilt trip from Friday to Sunday. And then my partner was away as well. So my mom was here, it was nice to have her. She hadn't seen the baby since she was like a very newborn. And so it was nice to get, for them to spend time together and to get the help. Parents be irritating, but but it was nice to see her. And shout out to the Village. April 26th, I get to see CBS
for your talk.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We'll mention that more about that later. But we do have a talk in Boston at the Lucy Parsons Center. Yeah. So that's coming up. So that'll be dope. Yes. Oh y'all. So probably the most important thing that has happened is that I have one of those I think it's boba like backpack type carriers for the baby, and she was not having it. I would put her in there and she would scream bloody murder, act like I was smushing her into a pancake. Well, she has finally, I think, gotten big enough to where she will get in there and not scream bloody murder. So that is very exciting because I have the boba wrap as well. So before I would just like wrap her to my body, but as she gets bigger, that gets a little bit heavier. So like I think the backpack is just that backpack carrier situation just absorbs more of the weight. So I am thrilled. Like that is the highlight of my life right now. I mean, shout out to the talks or whatever, but that's great. So yeah, so that's me. What's going on with you?
I guess so we both have this conference in Detroit coming up this weekend with community movement builders. It's not a conference. It's what is it? 2-day long, weekend long political education I don't know, what would you call it? Training.
And it's an internal thing.
Yeah,
internal to
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's nice to feel like putting some of this work that we're doing in public and be able to actually be in physical space with people that are not just students, for me anyway. So I'm looking forward to that. It is springtime. So those of you who used to watch
LDI.
Yes. Listen, I don't know why today I want to say LSD. Like it just keeps coming. I don't know why. Anyway, for those of you who used to watch LDI, I y'all know I love my plants, but it's been a busy year. And also the place that I live in now does not have great light all over, and so my plants are not thriving. Not all of some of them are, but not all of them are. So it is time for me to do some repotting, to get some new plants. You know, if y'all want to send any plants my way, I'll take them. Even just cuttings, like I don't even care what they are. But yeah, so that is something that I'm thinking about doing very soon, partially because I got news yesterday or 2 days ago that I've had yet another death in my family. This was my maternal grandmother's brother's wife, my aunt Inez. And I don't know if I mentioned all of them, but there have been about 3 or 4 deaths over the past 6 months, really. And so I had an interesting conversation today with one of my mentors, and I've just been thinking about my responses and my reactions to deaths ever since the death of my mother. I don't know if numb is the right word, but I think experiencing the loss of my mother was like such a particular kind of loss. And, still being alive, still having to move forward. I don't have the same like.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but still being alive, like. No. God damn it.
No, I mean it to say that, like, for me, that was one of the worst losses I could imagine. Yeah. And so to like have survived that, it's like, okay.
By comparison.
Yeah, by comparison. It is, it's hard to have the same kinds of emotional, but then that's also something that I worry about too. I'm like, okay, am I becoming numb to things? I don't necessarily think I am, because I'm not numb to other people's pain, but it's just, these are things. So the kind of juxtaposition of like just exponential death and thinking about ways to cultivate life. I think for me personally, it's been really nice, because on top of Sankara, I have another friend who had a baby a few months before Sankara, and I get to see him every Wednesday. And so I've been kind of in this moment of thinking about new life. So that's kind of just personal updates for me. Okay, so I am going to give the final update on the Zionist student. We discussed that article in the class. I don't think it at all the conversation went the way that she wanted it to go, but I was very proud of the rest of my students. I didn't actually realize this, but I have about like 10 or 12 other Jewish students in my class. So it's also just really interesting to think about the amount of energy and time that she has taken up in the classroom, in my world over this last semester, when there have been so many other students who are not necessarily struggling with the issues in the same way that she is, who have a different kind of understanding. So that is my final update. I am not going to talk about that or that student anymore. Also because class ends.
No, wait, hold on. Asterisk, because if she do some fuck shit for the final project, we have to have the update.
That is true.
So,
that is true.
Or you at least got to tell me. You ain't got to do it on the podcast, but I want to know.
So yes, so there's that. And then so I just have one other.
Sorry, this is funny.
Oh Lord. So I have just one quick announcement that I want to share with folks. So as you all know, I'm a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, and we are approaching the season of African Liberation Day.
Ow.
And I think it's this one. Yes. And We are actually moving to have our first African Liberation Day back in person in DC since before the pandemic. It's actually funny. This is as APRPGC, this is actually our first ALD since the death of my mother. The last ALD we had in person was in May of 2018 before she passed away. And that probably could tell you something about how instrumental she was to the process. And so African Liberation Day is the most wonderful time of the year.
Yeah, because it's a week after my birthday. You're absolutely right.
And so there are a variety of African Liberation Days happening around the country. Like I said, this is our first time coming back in person. So what I actually wanted to do with just to make a slight appeal to the audience, we are a small but mighty bunch, and there are some things that we need help with in terms of like either passing out flyers or helping with setup or cleanup on the day of. And if anybody is in the DC area and is interested in both, obviously we would love for you to come and just, participate, witness African Liberation Day. But if you also want to lend your hand to some very basic things, it would be very helpful. If that's something that you're interested in, you're more than welcome to either hit me up personally on any of my socials or to email us at lifestudyrevolution@gmail.com and let me know.
Yeah, and if you're in an organization, maybe your organization can help out, or if you're a professor, bring your student, get your students to come out, give them, well, I guess the term will be over by then, but so you can't give them extra credit, but spread the word.
Yes. All right. So like I said, that is posted on my page, and anybody feel free to follow up with me at any point about that. Okay. So that is it for our sort of, okay, cool. Thank y'all. That is it for our sort of life update.
In Baptist, I think.
Okay. That is it for our life update. So now we're moving into study, our study component. So if you all remember last week, we announced that we would be reading and discussing From Black Zionism to Black Nasserism, Du Bois and the Foundations of Black Anti-Zionist Discourse. So I don't know how many of you all actually got a chance to read the article. I think there are many things to be discussed that sort of come up as we move through the article. But I wanted to, I don't know, I guess I'll go ahead and make the announcement now, but I'm going to come back to it. So yesterday was April 7th, which was Mozambican Women's Day. And Mozambican Women's Day was declared so after the death of Hosina Michel, who was Samora Michel's partner, wife at one point in time. She was 25 years old when she passed away. And the occasion of April 7th is the day she actually passed away. And that was declared Mozambican's Women's Day. Am I saying that right? Yes.
Mozambican Women's
Day. Thank you. And so in thinking about that, I want to talk a little bit more about Hosina later on, but there is a Mozambican Women in Revolution pamphlet that she was one of the co-writers of. And I think it's really important to call attention to that particular pamphlet, but in general, these types of documents, because a lot of times the women who are involved in particularly armed struggle, these kind of places, don't have many instances where they have a lot of written documents, and usually where we find them are in these pamphlets. But there is a statement at the beginning of the pamphlet from Frelimo that I think gives some interesting context to our discussion that we're going to have around this particular reading. And so the pamphlet opens up with this quote from Frelimo. "The development of our struggle constantly gives rise to new situations which require new solutions. Certain approaches which yesterday appeared to us final and satisfactory, today seem inadequate, out of place, and sometimes incorrect. In the process of our growth, we learn, and sometimes through discussion of our experiences, sometimes inspired by the revolutionary experience of other peoples, we are able to find the most correct path suited to the specific phase of our development in every sphere, political, military, and in national reconstruction." And the reason why I think this particular quote is useful in moving into our discussion about Black Zionism and Black Nasserism is because in reading this particular piece, Sharice and I were talking, and we were talking about all of our, Pan-African favorites, who, not all, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of our favorites who did in the early days of the establishment of Israel have pro-Israel positions, right? And I think that when we look at what are some of the things that cause, one, them to have that position in the first place, and two, for them to shift that position over time, I think it's important for us to think about, one, what was the particular context, not even necessarily saying that they were right to have that position at the time, but why were they holding those positions in that time, in that context? How do we look at that? But also, how do we learn from it and to be able to say that, okay, this was an incorrect position at that time, and we have moved on from that. So I think that's just a good place for us to sort of start our discussion. Okay, so again, those of you who have gotten to read the piece, feel free to tap in the comments. Okay, so there are many things I think to discuss, but so, okay, in a general sense, right? This conversation has come up where we're thinking about folks like Du Bois, other people that are mentioned in passing or maybe referenced in the text, or people like Paul Robeson. I kind of went down I think Kwame Ture is also mentioned in the text. Kwame Nkrumah. And so I also kind of just went down a different rabbit hole, just sort of reading about what their positions were on Zionism or the state of Israel at the time of its creation and development.
Wait, I don't think Kwame Ture.
Yeah,
really?
In the text. In the text,
because he was in SNCC.
In the
and
text,
SNCC was okay.
In the
that's
text,
surprising.
In the text, she argues that I can't search in this document, but if you look up, she says there's a speech in New York early on that he had some kind of pro-Israel position very early on, and yes, again, but it shifts very quickly because we know that Kwame Ture was the last president of SNCC, and one of the reasons why SNCC kind of disbanded the way that it did at the time that it did was because of their public stance on Palestine and because of white liberal funders no longer wanting to support SNCC because of their public stance on Palestine, right? And so again, I think back to that quote that I read, that even if there are moments in time where we can point to where these people had these types of positions in support of the state of Israel, there were many examples of them quickly sort of shifting away from that. But the big sort of takeaway from the text, the argument I believe here is that the sort of Black Nasserism. So also there's some other things that I take issue with, I think, perhaps in the text. I think there are some things that are not necessarily historically correct about some of the just kind of things that are mentioned in passing. But what the argument that she makes is that very early on, particularly as like Du Bois was spending time in Germany and noticing Du Bois' time in Germany allowed him to see the way that Jewish people in Germany were being treated there across the world. And he begins to make these sort of connections between Black struggles in the US and Jewish struggles in Europe. And so this is largely the basis for why so many of these folks, Nkrumah included in the beginning, they have this view of the creation of the state of Israel as, I guess, something akin. So the language she uses, which I take issue with, is she constantly, I think, conflates or like puts Black Zionism, Black Orientalism, and Pan-Africanism together. And for me, I think this happens because her primary either reading or understanding of Pan-Africanism is in essence the sort of back to Africa situation, right? And so this idea of creating a state of Israel as a sort of birthright, a home place for Jewish people, is somehow related to this idea of creating a national home for Black people, particularly in the aftermath of the illegal trafficking of enslaved Africans, right? And so what I see then here is that because there is this early conflation of Black struggles in the U.S. with sort of Jewish struggles, it then becomes politically expedient to take this position in support of the state of Israel. But what then happens is that we quickly see.
You're missing a really important piece to this, which is that there's also anti-Arab sentiment.
Yes.
And so, and part of that is that's the sort of Black Orientalism that she talks about, whereby, for a number of reasons. So she talks about African Americans' experience with Arab Americans in the United States. There's also a latent critique of like the Ottoman Empire, and this idea that part of the reason why historical Palestine is underdeveloped is because of like Muslim rule through the Ottoman Empire. There's just the way that Western intellectuals, irrespective of race, take up a particular understanding of Islam because of the Christian orientation of the West. And so that also figures into why they ultimately take up this pro-Jewish stance. As well, I think that some people are trying to make up for earlier anti-Semitism. Because one thing about Du Bois is if you read the very first iteration of Souls of Black Folk, I can't remember exactly which essay it is, but he's talking about absentee ownership of land in the South. And he says Jewish landowners early on in that earlier iteration, but later on, especially as he cultivates a relationship with Herbert Aptheker, he switches it to white immigrant, right? And so I think that early on there is a anti-Semitism that people are over-correcting for, especially, for example, when Du Bois goes to Germany, or when people develop a different type of consciousness, right? So all of these are coalescing with the parallels that are being drawn between Black desire for a homeland or Black nationalism, and then the idea that Israel should be a homeland for Jewish folks.
And that in addition to that, under Nkrumah's leadership, Ghana does take initially a position in support of Israel. And one of the things that is highlighted here, is it in this text or is it a different one? Is that Israel, as it's being formed, it moves to establish diplomatic relationships with Ghana very quickly, because the reason why they want to do that is to get ahead of the sort of ideas of Pan-African unity that would allow that will come later on with the Suez Canal crisis with Gamal Abdel Nasser, that would allow sort of Black Africa, with all the problematics of that, to take a position in support of or have an understanding of themselves in relationship to the sort of Arabized regions of Africa, which in Israel's rationale would then make them sympathetic to the Palestinian plight, right? And so I think there is a mention of the fact that by virtue of establishing diplomatic relationships through Nkrumah with Ghana very early on, Israel is able to quickly establish, I think, 22 more embassies across the African continent as countries are gaining their independence. But again, the anti-Arabism is really important here, because they are literally trying to get ahead of these ideas about continental unity that would then take support away from the state of Israel, and to really to begin to understand Israel as a settler colony in the way that it is, as opposed to a sort of safe homeland for people who have been displaced, right? Go ahead.
And just something that is, because Black Studies has no political economy, something that's actually missing from this text is the way that early post-colonial right leaders were sympathetic to Israel for purposes of economic development. So many people might know that Ujamaa is modeled after Israeli kibbutz, right? And that there were Israeli technicians and agronomists who were involved in helping routed through the United States, who were involved in helping with setting up Ujamaa. And so there was also the economic component. Now, the other parallel too that's important to take into account is that, as we know, most of our revolutionary leaders initially attempted détente with the United States as well. So this is like a parallel. So Fidel Castro, Kwame Nkrumah went to the United States to help build the dam.
Hugo Chavez,
Maurice Bishop. So all of these people initially, right? So there wasn't, a lot of the revolutionary consciousness that we come to know and venerate is a product of the repression and a product of the attack by the United States when these countries are trying to go to them for like aid and development, right? And so I think similarly, there's a similar engagement with Israel because of the relative resources, because of it's a Western vassal state, right? That Israel has, and the way that they see it as a partnership in a certain type of development.
Yeah, I mean, because there's another piece on Africa as a country about Kwame Nkrumah and Israel, where they actually talk about the fact that when at the UN, when Israel is established, when Nkrumah makes sort of economic ass of the sort of Western world, it makes those ass of Israel in the same kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And Israel actually responds quite positively and does offer funds sort of very early on, up until this moment, one of the Suez Canal crisis, but also as there is a push to solidify their ideas about Pan-Africanism, and the OAU is formed, and there is a distinction between the sort of Monrovia and Casablanca groups. The Casablanca groups, which I believe were Guinea, Ghana, Mali, Egypt, I think Libya,
Ethiopia, maybe.
Yeah, I can't remember all of them, but those were some of the sort of main heads of state that then begin to sort of shift this perspective away from Israel sort of being this like, you know, safe ground for Jewish people, and understanding it as, you know, a different level, a different type, a different kind, whatever, or not, actually not a different type or kind, but a different level of neo-colonial, settler colonialism, exploitation. And so while we see, you know, early on in Du Bois's career, early on, again, and all these people, Nkrumah, Paul Robeson, whatever, this early sympathy towards the establishment of the state of Israel, there are these very particular critical political moments that then shift their perspectives on what is actually happening there,
right,
and what is the actual right position to take on it, as we too are people who are struggling for our own freedom and liberation, and in struggles over land.
Right. And that, so the critical turning point, right, is the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. I think that that was when positions really bifurcated, right, between, for example, like the old civil rights establishment and then like the so-called new left, or like the newer, more militant activists. But the Suez Canal, which crisis, which I think is 52, right? Suez Canal is an early fracture, I think.
Yeah, and that is the way that it's talked about in this particular article, as an early fracture.
Sorry, we're looking up the Suez Canal. Was it 52? Who knows? Drop it in the chat.
Yeah, I know. Anywho.
56.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So, read this. Yeah. So there was, so in terms of, so one of the really big like pivots really is the treatment of Jewish folks leading up to World War II and during World War II, right? So the Holocaust, this really was a main driver of the sympathy and this idea that Jews really were not safe anywhere in the world except for in Israel, right? And Poland was very important to this. So Du Bois has a quote, right? Now, I'm going to talk about the irony of this quote for our current moment, but he said, "I have seen something of a human upheaval in this world. The screaming shots of a race riot in Atlanta, the marching of the Ku Klux Klan, the threats of courts and police, the neglect and destruction of human habitation, but nothing in my wildest imagination was equal to what I saw in Warsaw in 1949. I would have said before seeing it that it was impossible for a civilized nation with deep religious convictions and outstanding religious institutions, with literature and art, to treat fellow human beings as Warsaw had been treated. There had been complete, planned, and utter destruction. Some streets had been so obliterated that only by using photographs of the past could they tell where the street was. And no one mentioned the total of the dead, the sum of destruction, the story of crippled and insane, the widows and orphans." Now, this is Du Bois describing Warsaw in 1949. You could easily remove Warsaw and put in Gaza today, and you can see why there are so many anti-Zionist Jews. And we can bet our top dollar that if Du Bois were alive today, he absolutely would be aghast at what Israel is doing, right? And so again, so thinking with that initial quote that Layla read, this is part of the reason why people's consciousness change over time, right? So, and we're seeing it happen right now with her goofy ass student, but like, you know, people who are either on the fence or who might have been Zionists at a certain point, because literally of that death and destruction, you can't help but to support Gaza at this point, in a way that at that particular historical moment, people felt compelled to support Israel because of the epistemicide, the genocide, like, and the complete repression. And so I think that now people who are Zionists now, to not see these parallels, to not see the irony, or the not even irony, to see the cruelty, the absolute fuckery of supporting a state of Israel, given the reality of what's happening in Gaza, is just unconscionable, right?
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that we've talked about. It actually even came up in the discussion in my class when we were talking about this, is the degree to which the state of Israel is actually manufacturing anti-Semites because of the ways that the horror that Israel is the havoc that is wreaking upon Gazans and people of Palestinians in general. There are people who probably for their entire lives have been largely indifferent to the struggles of Palestinians, but because again of what we're seeing unfold, before our very eyes, there are people who are conflating Jewish people with Zionists. And I think that is why it's actually really important to be able to have this conversation that actually really does truly distinguish a person who is Jewish, whether by faith or by culture. Although actually, so I watched the interesting, I have to find it, but I watched the interesting conversation with a rabbi, I can't remember his name at the moment, but he was talking about this question about who Jews are, and what makes a person a Jewish person. And he as a rabbi, in the sort of theological tradition, makes the argument that Judaism is not a culture, Judaism is not a race, it is only a religion. And it is a religion you are a Jew by virtue of getting the charge from God to uphold these, and not just the 10 Commandments, but it's some larger number, right? And his argument is that even as we understand Jewish culture to be this particular New York Ashkenazi bagels and whatever, I mean, this is his words, not mine. He was like, that is a regional geographic culture, but that is not Jewish culture, because if you go to Morocco, or whatever other places, people who are Jewish are not necessarily eating matzah balls, they're not necessarily eating all these things that we in our particular locales have come to associate with Judaism. And so for him as a rabbi, Judaism is only a religion.
But isn't it true that Judaism as a culture, including the revival of Hebrew, came about precisely in this moment of the establishment of Israel to cultivate a Jewish as these cultural artifacts that are ascribed to Judaism? Because I think they were saying that prior to the revival of Hebrew, people spoke like Yiddish or whatever, because Hebrew was only a written language.
Yeah, I mean, because that's the other thing he was like, there are Arabic speaking Jews who refer to God as Allah, because that is the language that they speak, right? And it's not necessary, so I think this conversation about Israel as an ethno-religious state for people who are Jewish, and and that includes the sort of atheist Jews, whatever, cultural Jews, who don't necessarily have an understanding of themselves as religious Jews. These are, I think, all are important historical and contextual reasons why we have to understand how and why this particular understanding of Jewishness and the need for the state of Israel exists, and why in pushing back against it, there is a principled stand that is an anti-Zionist stand, which is not about victimizing Jewish people on the basis of their Jewishness, but it is about pushing back against the death and destruction of the state of Israel as a place.
It's their colonialism, period. And we push back. We don't like the fucking handkerchief heads who are imperialists either. We don't fuck with them either. So it's like there's nothing about your identity, whatever the identity is, woman, gay, Jewish, Black, ashy, left-handed. There's nothing about your identity that absolves you from perpetuating imperialism, colonialism, warmongering, capitalist exploitation, etc., even as a group. And so that I think is really important. And that is why identifying the European roots, the European imperialist roots of Israel is also very important because that also describes why there can be so many anti-Zionist Jews, right? And by the way, there's really not a parallel to that within Black people, since everybody always wants to create these fucking parallels to every single thing. There's a comparison to Black people. There's not that many anti-nationalist Black people. Even Marxist Black people tend to have some sort of, whether it's revolutionary nationalist or some sort of nationalist sentiment, because that is fundamentally not rooted in imperialism or colonialism. It's just not. Like, historically, it's not the same thing. And we don't see any, what Europeans do you know that are going to bat to create a homeland for Black people? And don't say Liberia, because they were getting rid of all the free Blacks and dumping them in a fucking enclave. Liberia, so it's just Sierra Leone. Right. So it's not the same thing at all. Not at all. And what is the opposite for Africans, right? They carved up these artificial boundaries for the purpose of expropriation. So whereas these parallels were being drawn between the Jewish and Black experience at a particular historical moment that created the conditions for support for Israel, we also can see these disjunctures, especially as they relate to like Western imperialism and colonialism, that I think, again, creates conditions for not being supportive of a state of Israel or any state that's fundamentally rooted in like dispossession, including the United States.
I'm trying to understand the atheist Jew. That atheist Jew is the creator of Zionism.
Wait, are there there's Christian Israelis?
Yes. There are Orthodox Christians. Yes. Yeah. Okay. I don't know that there's a whole lot more to say about that article in particular, but I do think that in having that, this is something too that I think also helps disrupt this conversation, because I think more often than not, we see this claim that I think, and this is why people act like there is supposed to be this like unspoken, unwritten, like perpetual alliance between Black and Jewish people because of because of the history of the Holocaust, because of the ways that they try to make the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the Holocaust connected. But I think that in rehashing these histories, I think it's really important to utilize that to really kind of disentangle ourselves from this. And when I say ourselves, I mean the sort of general Black population, from this notion that we're supposed to have this uncritical alliance with Jewish people by virtue of this particular type of history of dispossession, when at this point, like, the question I always have again is, clearly for Israelis, that the quote or the saying of never again only applies to a particular set of people. Because I don't know what is more horrific about it's already a horrific instance where people are being bombed to death, or being starved to death, carpet bombed. But then to me, what actually makes it even more egregious is that this is done by people who this was done to in the name of it not happening to them again, right? And I think that this is something that we have to be able to have this conversation about this. What I think a lot of mainstream Black people carry is this kind of uncritical alliance with Jewish people. And again, it's not Jewish people, but the conflation of Judaism and Zionism means that people think that this uncritical alliance with Jewish people means that you must support the state of Israel. And that even if our historical faves, the people who we look to for our moral compass on a lot of things, had a not great position on that at some point in time, we have to look at, again, this sort of evolution of what is actually happening in the world in a material sense that actually changes our position on these things.
Yeah. And like John Henry Clark said, Black people don't owe anybody anything but an ass whooping. So it's not that these solidarities are not trans-historical, period. They have to do with principles. They have to do with taking like objective positions on things, right? And perhaps it will change over time, right? Who knows what these different states will look like 50 years from now, right? And these alliances definitely they're not totalizing, and they're not anything, again, they're not trans-historical. So we need to remain vigilant about this. And I think part of that also is like not uncritically then supporting some other state just because it's whatever the modifier is, like in this context, just because it's an Arab state or just because it's a Muslim state or whatever, right? Like I don't believe that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't believe that. I think the enemy of my enemy can also be my enemy, right? Or neutral or whatever.
Somebody I just don't pay attention.
Exactly. And so I think so. And again, it's about this because that's political immaturity, thinking that, oh, I'm going to support this because that, right? I think we do need to understand the way the imperialism is the primary contradiction and how other countries can sort of be heightening those contradictions. But at the same time, like this uncritical support is also not good, right? Because that means we're not being rigorous in our analysis and our political commitment. So, but I don't see any principled way that any principled support of Israel. I just don't see it. I at the same time that I understand why people who are indoctrinated do support Israel uncritically and see it as politically necessary and all that other shit. But I keep saying, like, those folks need to ask themselves, like, when people say like you're not safe anywhere but in Israel, you should be organizing against that. That should be the problem. That should be a big problem for you, because you're paying taxes and doing whatever else in these states. And for people to say you can only be safe with the existence of this entity, to me also conveys the anti-Semitism of the project of Israel in general. So, yeah.
And to speak on that more, do you want to bring up this Rwanda-Israel situation?
Yeah, speaking of never again. So yesterday, what marked the 30th or 40th? The 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And was it Museveni? Is that the current president, right? Museveni is had a meeting with some Israeli. Sorry, we struggling, y'all. I'm trying to talk it through, and it's not working.
No, just go ahead.
Anyway, so he had this meeting with the Israeli minister who gave him like a Star of David to convey solidarity between the two countries and thanking Paul Kagame, not Museveni, but anyway, thanking Paul Kagame for being a true friend of Israel, and unironically, right, saying that this genocide was a terrible thing, it can never happen again, but not at all acknowledging what's happening in Gaza, except to say that I presented you with the necklace bearing the unequivocal demand to bring home the hostages brutally held captive by the terrorist organization Hamas in Gaza. So the fact that a genocide is being committed currently in Gaza is completely lost, I guess, on both Kagame and on this Israeli prime minister. So this, I think, relates back to our conversation about the importance of Pan-Africanism, right? And again, about being critical in our politics, because we can't root for everybody Black. We can't root for everybody African. Pan-Africanism is a political position that has very particular tenets, of which supporting Israel is not one.
And it also means that we even I mean, I think we've had this conversation as it related to like what was happening in Burkina Faso, what was happening in Mali, what's happening in Niger, is that these are ongoing struggles, right? And so we do have to continue to keep an eye on what's happening. So again, this is not necessarily in relationship to Kagame himself, but even when we've had progressive leaders who we've supported, at the point in which they begin to do things that we have to be able to continue to be principally critical of those things, even if there is a long track record of other good things. At the point at which people begin to turn and shift, we as the masses of people have to continue to recognize, to call attention to those things, and to essentially keep us ourselves on track, right? That is, again, why we always talk about remaining in organizations, because if we only have to do these things as individuals, if we only have to maintain our principles as individuals, we can compromise them at any point in time. And being in these collective environments is what allows us to continue to be checked, to have, to have criticism, self-criticism, and also to be able to grow and develop, right? To be able to be pushed on some of our positions. And that's, I think, is something that's really important in the context of this conversation, but also for us, for those of us who think about ourselves as activists, as organizers, as politically mature in any kind of way. These are things that we have to keep abreast of and continue to watch as they unfold.
Yeah, and it's not surprising that Kagame would be sympathetic to Israel, given their support for the genocide that's happening in the Congo, and which is, the so-called civil war. What's happening in Congo is not a civil war. It's a global capitalist-backed, decades-long destabilization project for plunder. That's a mouthful, but that's what it is. It's not a civil war. And surely those weapons and any sort of technological support is also coming from Israel, right? So, and, other folks have made connections between Israel funding, I think it's the RSF in Sudan, right? And how, so it seems to me that there's Israeli weapons along with US weapons all up and through all of these genocidal, super violent, destabilizing conflicts. And so this has a lot of implications, right? Whether it's UN votes, which we'll talk about it in a minute, whether it's, people criticizing those who do stand up, like all the people who are the nations that criticize Israel, that criticize South Africa for taking Israel before the ICJ. So, and all of this, again, is rooted also in imperialism and in colonialism and neocolonialism, because so many of these nations feel like they have to align with the West or they can't be as critical as they would be otherwise because of aid regimes, right? Aid as the carrot, invasion as the stick. Because of underdevelopment and dependency, all of these things mean that all of so many political decisions, especially of these comprador rulers, are circumscribed by like that economic dependency. So that always needs to be put into context.
Okay. And so on to the one that we actually brought up accidentally. Okay. All right. So on April 5th, there was a vote. There was a vote. So I'll just read it. In a historic turn of events today, April 5th, the United Nations Human Rights Council voted in favor of a resolution calling for a ban on arms sales to Israel to prevent further violations of international humanitarian law and violations of abuses of human rights. And so part of what we wanted to talk about was some of the actual voting, like who voted in support of who, not some, well, yes, who abstained, but who voted no. So obviously Germany is very interesting. So and those are Argentina, Bulgaria, Germany, Malawi, Paraguay, and the United States. Let's see, the African countries that voted in favor included Algeria, Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, Eritrea, the Gambia, Ghana, Morocco, Somalia, South Africa, and Sudan. Now, the thing that's interesting about these UN votes is, one, they're largely performative.
Yeah, they're non-binding.
Yes, they're non-binding. And again, I mean, I think that there is importance. So what I think actually is important about bringing this stuff before the ICJ, about having these conversations at the level of the UN, is that it is continuing to keep the conversation in people's, on people's mouths, in people's minds, and it is a part of what is responsible. Sorry, that is not what it's part of. But continuing to have these conversations allows this continuous shift in the court of public opinion, right? Because I don't think that. I mean, I think there's always been the sort of select few who have had this position on Palestine, but I think the times that we are in are actually really quite unprecedented in terms of the general masses of human beings across the earth actually being, having eyes on Palestine, having these particular kinds of conversations. And so as these votes occur, they keep sort of pressure in the public, they keep pressure on Israel, they keep pressure from the masses of people to continue to see this for what it is, which is an ongoing genocide, a colonial settlement, like all of these things, right? But again, the sort of performance of doing but also because it's performative, because it's non-binding, that is what makes the vote of Malawi and these other places even more egregious, because you don't really stand to lose. Well, maybe some financial support, I don't know, but you don't really stand to lose or gain much by way of these votes, right? But that they are still moving in this position to make their support of Israel known in a very particular way.
Yeah, so I think that the other thing too is like, so right, when I see these type of votes, I'm looking up like, well, what's going on in Malawi, right? Like, why is it that, in fact, was it Malawi that has the female genital mutilation back? That wasn't Malawi.
No, that wasn't Malawi. That was Gambia, I believe.
Well, okay, so anyway, but it makes you kind of look like what's going on in this country that they're voting, right? And ultimately, it always comes back to who is the ruler and what their sort of economic situation is ultimately, right? And so I think, it's really absurd. I can't imagine why any country that has suffered colonialism or imperialism would vote in align with the West, again, unless it has to do with like some type of aid restrictions or whatever. But my other question is like, where was everybody else at? Because I think there was that's like 36 people.
Yeah,
ain't there like hundreds of nations in the United Nations? Where everybody else was at? Like they on spring break or something. But
so why do you guys say it's performative? Do you mean the specific resolution or the UN as a whole? I mean, honestly, the UN.
Well, they're non-binding. So what's the point?
They're not binding, but also all of up until very recently, the UN Security Council has been almost exclusively like under the control, the arm of the US and Israel. And so we ostensibly have this like, supranational body where people are supposedly making decisions on behalf of human beings, but for the most part, again, the non-binding thing, nothing really gets pushed through and nothing gets implemented in a real way unless it has the material support of the US and Israel. And so in a lot of ways, the UN is, again, to me, a performative body because it's a theater.
So it is and it's not. It is as an instrument of justice. It's not as an instrument of Western hegemony and Western interest, because the these UN missions that gave hundreds of thousands of people fucking cholera in Haiti, that's a real thing, right? The UN as at the forefront of the invasion
of Patrice Lumumba,
of the recolonization or the invasion of Haiti, like that's real. Like those are real material consequences. But I think that it's absolutely it's performative as a body through which justice can be achieved for racialized and colonized people. But I think that, so for example, when like the Civil Rights Congress filed the We Charge Genocide petition in 1951, they knew they weren't like so William Patterson even said, like, we're not looking for redress per se. The point was to galvanize a mass movement globally. And for consciousness raising. And so I think in that regard, to the extent that people are paying attention, right? And it's important in that regard. And also as a form of like documentary practice. So like people who go and testify and give speeches and that type of thing, I think it's important in that regard, right? It's kind of like voting, right? Or electoralism in a particular way. Like it can be important for like consciousness raising, for like cutting your teeth at organizing, that type of thing. But as a panacea for like any type of liberation, absolutely fucking not. Yeah, my baby's crying.
Okay, well, that actually brings us to our sort of closing. And so again, I've already mentioned this, but I wanted to just take a moment to come back to Hasina Michelle. So this is just a picture of her. And so what I think is really useful about, again, so we've also had this conversation about the usefulness of these commemorative days. I think on LDI we did a conversation about the actual working history of International Women's Day, as opposed to the sort of particular ways it's been co-opted as like girl boss propaganda by sort of neoliberal Western elements. But again, so like I've mentioned before, Josina Michelle she was actually quite young. She was 25 years old when she died, which I also think is actually another thing that makes thinking through this pamphlet, which is the Mozambican Women in the Revolution, and the work that they did to bring this document to light, to actually talk about what was the role and responsibility of Mozambican women in the struggle for their liberation. But also what I also find interesting is that, so within Frelimo, they, I think they called it the women's department or women, it was a particular word that they used, because there were many instances where women's groups were formed as a sort of a way of, what do you call it?
Like auxiliary?
A kind of succession from already existing organizations, right? But the women's department of Frelimo was a mechanism whereby the women inside of Frelimo recognized that there were particular things that they had to call attention to discuss amongst themselves, but did not take the position of separating themselves from their male comrades in struggle. I think so. The whole pamphlet is about 30 pages, and I think it's interesting. But I think there were a couple things that I wanted to bring out or call attention to, just a couple paragraphs. So this particular piece that I'm going to read from is the role of women in the revolution. I'm just going to read the first opening. So it was in October 1966, in a meeting of the Central Committee, that Frelimo decided that the Mozambican women should take a more active part in the struggle for national liberation at all levels. It was decided that she should receive political and military training in order to make her more capable of fulfilling whatever task the revolution might demand of her. And so there are a couple places where they talk about the role and the responsibility of the women. And I think so this is also a particular time, right? We have to remember like what's happening, how are women culturally, societally situated in this particular moment. And they are largely relegated to these positions of, mother, of cook, of cleaner, right? And so a lot of what the conversation was at this particular time, and this is not just in Frelimo, this is across the board. When you see all these women's documents in the sort of 50s and 60s and even early 70s, that there is this particular push to demonstrate to women that it is equally important that we take up our role and our responsibility in the revolution, and not just as caregivers, but also to pick up arms and armed struggle, but also as a recruiting arm. And so this is one of the things that I found interesting in this particular piece. It says, women are encouraged to give their opinion in meetings, to participate in the various committees, etc. Here we have the rather difficult task of fighting old prejudices that women's functions should be confined to cooking, rearing children, etc. It has been proven that we women can perform the task of mobilization and education better than men for two reasons. Firstly, it is easier for us to approach other women. And secondly, the men are more easily convinced of the important role of women when confronted with the unusual sight of confident and capable female militants who are themselves the best example of what they are propounding. However, our activities are directed equally at the men, and the presence of emancipated women bearing arms often shames them into taking more positive action. The other thing I wanted to mention when I first started this is that more often than not, when these women figures are talked about, they're talked about in relationship to their male partners, right? But that with Josina in particular, it was actually her political work that made her catch the eye of Samora Machel, as opposed to her relationship with him bringing her into. And I think that that's really important, because even in thinking about, we don't talk about relationships a whole lot, but I think that it is important to think about what it means when we build friendships, intimate relationships, families, and what it is that we build those relationships on the basis of, right? And so for me, understanding this story, that it was partially her already existing commitment to struggle for her people that made her appealing to him, but also that all the work that she did made her a significant figure, even in her short 25 years of life. So much so that that Mozambican Women's Day was created in the aftermath of her death, and that it was an opportunity not only to remember the legacy of Hasina Michelle, but also to remember the legacy of women in struggle, right? So the last thing that I'll share is another paragraph towards the end. It says, thus apart from its strictly military functions, the women's detachment, that's what it's called. The women's detachment has important political duties on two levels. At one level, it is charged with the mobilization and education of the people to increase the effectiveness of their participation by developing their political understanding of the war. This we do for everyone, irrespective of sex, although we have a unique opportunity to reach our own sex that is denied our male comrades. Once this has been achieved, we work at the next level of encouraging even more active participation by inviting people to follow our example, to leave their homes and train as fighters, nurses, teachers, etc. In this way, the size of the women's detachment has increased considerably since that first experimental group, and the point has now been reached where some of those first recruits have gained enough experience and knowledge so that they can become political and military trainers for their own detachment, and also assist their male colleagues in the basis to instruct elements of the population. And so again, I think what's interesting about this is that they're actually offering really a theory of how women should be contributing to revolutionary developments, and what it is that we actually have to offer based on very material things, right? The idea that they were suited to recruit people into struggle in a particular way, because they could talk to women in a particular way, because there are these particular ways that they were perceived, I think is really important. And it's something that I think we should continue to meditate on as we think about in our contemporary moments, what are our responsibilities as activists, as thinkers. What are the bases on which we are recruiting people to our struggle? How are we making people understand what's important about doing these types of readings, about understanding these particular histories as they evolve and develop over the course of our lifetimes? And again, what is our role and our contribution to particular revolutionary struggle? Okay, so Sharice is having to tend to her motherly duties. Let's see. At the last meeting of the Central Committee in April 1969, it was decided that the Mozambican Women's League, LIFEMO, should be completely fused with the women's detachment, and we are still in the process of integrating into the Army all of the activities formerly carried on by LIFEMO. During its existence, LIFEMO did some useful work, but with the development of struggle, the demands of the war inevitably required that all its efforts be concentrated inside Mozambique, and hence be constructed by the women's detachment in the interior. Okay, so again, I just wanted to call attention to that because Mozambican Women's Day was yesterday, which was also the day of Hasina Michelle's death. And let's see, I'm gonna go through the comments a bit. Let's see, work on polycentric, Madonna Ill, not Madonna built a hospital in Malawi. Okay, all right, so that is for the most part it for what we had to cover for today. CBS is coming back to begin to wrap us up.
Sorry, y'all, my baby is crying really hard. Yeah, so that was a great discussion of Mozambican Women's Day and Hasina. Was it Hasina Michelle? Mm-hmm. Thank you for any point on that. So thanks and thank y'all for tapping in. It's a little bit shorter today, but I think that we covered a lot of ground. Yeah, we did. Can't wait next week to see y'all comments so that we can read the comments from this and last week. Return back to some of the things that we talked about today. And let us know if you want us to invite Nadia Alahamed on to talk about the article and our position on it. Just let us know.
Yeah, and we have our long running list of your suggestions about who we should invite on, most of which we are on board with, some of which we probably won't. I mean, for different reasons, but we will be organizing that in the coming months. I think, this is the end of the semester for me, so it is a particularly crazy time for me right now, these next 2-3 weeks. And then because of African Liberation Day, May is going to be crazy too. So I'm going to put that appeal out one more time. If folks are willing to help in any capacity with ALD on the ground in DC, I think the dates are May 19th, May 18th, May 19th. Please let me know. Also continue to share with us folks you would like for us to bring, or even things, if there are things that you want to read together, you can also make those suggestions. Again, not everything that you all suggest we'll do, but we welcome the suggestions and we will decide as we move along.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all.
All right.
See you next week.
Time.
Bye.